Hey everybody, welcome back to another tutorial series. In this one we're going to be working on doing a mixed media piece. So we're going to be using watercolours and coloured pencils for this painting, and I'm going to be doing a mixture of a realistic style, especially for the face, and then I'm also going to be incorporating a very expressive loose style as well for the hair and for the neck and the shoulder and also the clothing. So here you can see the final painting that we're going to be working on. And in the first part of this series, we're going to get started by painting the skin. So I've started off with the basic sketch outline down on the paper. The sketch outline reference is attached for you guys, and also the materials list is in the description. You can see that I've taped the paper down on all four sides to stop it from warping and to keep it from moving around on the desk. I'm using cold press paper for this, and I'm using it in a size 9x12. I'm starting off by mixing the colours for the skin. I'm going to be doing a darker colour and then a lighter colour for the skin so that we can add in some shadows and get in a base wash for the whole of the skin. I'm mainly mixing in some pinks and red tones and some browns because her skin is a bit more pink toned. And once I've got in a bit of pink, a bit of brown, a bit of yellow ochre as well, I'm adding in some water just to dilute it down a bit. I'm also adding in a little bit of purple, as I think that by looking at the shadows in her skin, this is the shadowed colour that I'm mixing up. I thought that a bit of a purple undertone would work really nicely for the shadows. I'm also mixing in a tiny bit of Payne's Grey to also deepen up the colour. So I just mixed in a little bit of Payne's Grey. Overall, you'll just need to mix a little bit of red with some yellow ochre, then mixed in a little bit of brown, and finally the purple and the Payne's Grey to darken up the base a bit. Then I'm just taking some of that paint and putting it into another palette, and I'm adding some water to this and a little more of the yellow ochre just to dilute that skin tone and also make it a little more of a natural colour, because with the shadow we've put in a lot of purple, whereas for the midtones and highlights on her skin I wanted that to be more of a usual skin tone colour, not with purple in it. So I added more yellow ochre and a little bit more brown. And now I'm just simply mixing in lots of water to make sure that it's really light. So I'm not adding in any more colour, I'm just adding in some more water. I'm now taking that paint on a larger round brush, and I'm just going to spread this all over the skin. So I'm going to be adding this everywhere, all over her face. And the only area that I'm going to be avoiding adding this to is going to be the eyes. Also, I'm avoiding going over any large areas of hair. You do want to work fairly quickly as you're doing this step, because you don't want to have any harsh edges appear where you stop one area of skin and then go back to it a few minutes later. So try and keep it a very quick wash of colour. So I'm just going to continue until I've got this base wash down on the whole of the skin. If you're unsure whether you've mixed a colour that you think is accurate to the reference, then just get a scrap piece of paper and just test it on that scrap piece of paper first and see if you're happy with it, because quite often it will look a lot darker in the palette than it does when it's applied to the paper. So now you can see we've got a really nice base tone down, and I'm also going to add that colour down onto the neck as well. I'm just looking throughout the face and throughout the hair, and I'm just adding in a little more of the skin tone colour between the gaps in the hair where we can see some of the skin peeping through. And I'm just looking back over the painting and the reference and seeing if I've missed any areas out. Once you're happy with your base layer and your first light wash of skin tone, it's time to go in with our second colour, the more concentrated pinky purple version, and start to add in the shadows. So I'm looking very closely at the reference image now, and I'm just blocking in anywhere on the face that is darker. So I'm just getting in all of the shadows. And if we look at the reference, the shadowed areas are mainly on the side of the face, especially where the hair is covering a portion of the face and stopping light from getting to it. There's also a lot of shadow on the neck. The neck is a lot darker than the face. There's a bit of shadow on the bottom of the chin and just underneath the lips. Look to see where the shadows curve and continue round. So that shadow under the lip, it continued towards the side of the face. I'm also going to add the shadow on the other side of the face as well. Also on the forehead, there may be a bit more shadow because again the hair is overlapping onto that part of the skin. And I'm also working on adding in some shadow around the eyes. So there's a lot of shadow, particularly between the eyelid and the eyebrow, and also underneath the eye as well. I'm then moving on to adding some shadow to the nose. The main parts of the nose that are shadowed are the sides of the nose and also the bottom part of the nose where the nostrils are. You need to make sure that you're working fast when you're doing this, as you need to make sure that you're applying these shadows whilst that first wash of colour is still wet. Because what we're using is the wet on wet technique, where basically you make sure the surface is always wet whilst you're using this technique, and the colours will bleed and softly blend into each other without you having to try and blend them out yourself. So you can see that by adding in the shadows whilst the first layer of watercolour was still wet, we haven't got any harsh edges and the skin looks really smooth and natural. If you notice that your paper is starting to dry before you finish your layer, don't worry about it, let it completely dry and then re-wet it again with some clean water and go in and just tap in those shadows and it will still bleed out nicely. Also, you can use a clean damp brush if you do want to blend out anything a bit more yourself. I'm just softening out some edges, and you want to make sure that your brush is damp rather than wet. Otherwise, if there's too much water on your brush, then you'll get those cauliflower effects and some back runs happening. I'm just adding a little more shadow underneath the chin, and we are going to be building up multiple layers for the skin. So don't worry if you haven't got it dark enough with this first layer. It is a layering process. I'm just adding that darker paint down the neck again. Now taking that clean damp brush and just blending out the edges to create a smoother gradient. You can do that in areas where it hasn't bled out enough on its own. I'm going to keep the neck fairly expressive, so I'm not worried too much about making the neck super smooth because I'm going to use some more expressive techniques on that area. But the face itself, I want to be quite realistic. So I'm trying my best to keep the face nice and smooth. So whilst I'm waiting for that layer to dry, I'm just going to apply a little bit of that base wash, that light wash of skin tone, onto the shoulder. And once again, with the shoulder, I'm going to keep it quite expressive, so I'm not worrying about getting everything super smooth. I'm leaving some brush strokes showing, as I want the face to be really realistic, but everything around the face I want to be super loose and expressive. I just tapped in a little bit of shadow at the top of the shoulder, and I'm going to add a couple of splatters around the shoulder, just again to give it that loose, expressive feel to it. So now you can see that we've got a nice base layer down for all of our skin. We've started to get in where the shadows are and give a little bit of depth to the face. We now just need to build up more layers. So the next thing that I'm going to do is just take a light grey, and I'm mixed in a little bit of that skin tone colour in with the light grey. So basically I'm using a very diluted black, and then a bit of the skin tone colour, and I'm just filling in the white of the eyes. And then drying my brush, and I'm just lifting off the excess paint, and I just want to stain the white of the eyes. I don't want to make them too dark. So I just paint in some of that watercolour, and then you can use a dry brush, a clean dry brush, just to lift off some of that paint, as I'm doing now, just to lighten it up, and that will give a nice tint to the eyes, to the white of the eye, because no matter how light it looks in the reference, there's always going to be some sort of shading to the white of the eyes. It's never truly white. I'm adding a little more shadow at the top and bottom and the inner corner of the eye, just to give more of a 3D spherical look to the white of the eye. Once again, I'm just doing this whilst that first layer dries, because we can't add any more layers on the skin yet. I'm just taking a tiny bit of that greyish skin toney colour, and I'm just working that underneath the eye to add a little bit of a grey shadow, because you can see in the reference that the shadow is a very purpley grey tone. And I've got hardly any of this paint on my brush. I'm going to mix up a little more of that same colour, so a little bit of that skin tone mixed in with a little bit of a grey, and you can mix in a bit of purple as well. And I'm just working this around for the shadows around the eye, which is mainly above that crease on the eyelid, and then it curves around towards the inner corner and then to the bottom of the eye, so underneath the eye as well. And I'm also going to repeat that same process for the other eye. Once again, focusing on adding the shadow underneath the eye and above the eye, mainly above the eyelid. And then I'll come back to talk you guys through the next part. I'm now going to move on to using that same colour to add a little bit more shadow for the nose, starting with the nostrils and that underneath part of the nose, and then also adding a few lines to indicate the side of the nose. Don't worry, we won't be leaving it this harsh. We're going to be blending it out using a clean damp brush. Just blend out those edges, and you've got to do this whilst the paint is still wet, otherwise you will end up with harsh sort of outlines. So make sure that you do this straight away once you've added in where the shadows are. Clean off your brush and then blend it out, just tapping in a little bit more of that colour just to darken it up. And you can see that now we've got a really nice natural shadow. I also added a little bit of shadow just above the nostril on the tip of the nose. And I added a little bit of shadow for the cupid's bow. Next, I'm going to move on to the mouth. Firstly, adding in those shadows on the outer corner of the lips. Blending them downwards, as that's where the shadow fades out. It fades out towards the chin. Also extending that shadow down towards the chin and underneath the lips, making sure to leave a little gap where that highlight is, either side, just below like the outer corners of the lips. There's those two little highlights just below it. So now I'm mixing up a bit more of the skin tone. Using those exact same colours, I just want to try and mix up that same colour again, because we're going to be working on adding in more shadows. So I'm mixing up the purple, the Payne's grey. I'm mixing up those colours to start with, that's why it's looking so weird. And then mixing in a little bit of that red. And so I've mixed up that same grey purple tone so that I can continue to go in and add in some more of those shadows. So I haven't re-wet this yet, by the way. It's not like blending or bleeding out itself. It is gonna potentially get harsh edges if I wasn't to soften out the edges with the clean damp brush. I just didn't want to re-wet the area yet because I wanted to get some nice sort of defined shadows. I don't want them to be too defined, but if you re-wet the surface quite a lot, then your shadows can bleed out too much. So I wanted to make sure I was getting in those darkest shadows and getting them in the right place. You can be a bit more precise when you work on a dry piece of paper, on the dry layer. And as you can see, I'm softening out that shadow using a clean damp brush. Just fading out the edges. So once you've let that layer then dry, I've let it dry and now I'm going in with some clean water and I'm going to pre-wet the whole of the skin. Once again, just avoiding the eyes, and you want to get a nice even layer of water all over the skin. Don't add puddles of water, but make sure that you've covered each area, otherwise you might get any harsh edges if you miss out certain parts. So now that you've pre-wet the skin, it's time to go in and add some shadows. So I'm going to be using that same shadowed colour, but I've mixed in a bit more red and brown to make it more of a natural skin tone, so that it's not so dull. And I'm just going to do the same process of looking at the reference, identifying areas of the skin in the reference that are darker than they are in my painting, and I'm just going to go throughout the skin and just darken up any areas that are shadowed. There's shadows in the skin to make it more accurate to the reference. So I'm basically just focusing on getting in the shadows, mainly on the side of the face. Now extending towards the lips and the chin. Also adding a bit of shadow to the side of the nose and blending that downwards in a curved motion to give the right form for the cheeks. Going back to the forehead, just adding the shadows between the locks of hair and also adding in the shadows for the eyes. It's really easy to get a smooth look when you're using the wet and wet method. I'm really focusing on getting in the shadow underneath the eyes, looking back and forth between the reference and my painting to make sure that I've got it the right shape and the right thickness. Going over to the other eye and just repeating the same process. One thing to bear in mind as well is that watercolours do dry lighter than they look when they're wet. So even though you may think that you've done your shadows dark enough, it will probably dry lighter, and therefore you might need to go in and add another layer to keep darkening it up. So bear in mind that watercolours do dry lighter than they look when they're wet. Mixing up some more of that skin tone, again using the Payne's Grey, some purple, then adding in the red, a bit of brown, a bit more Payne's Grey. So the main three colours that I'd use if I wanted to mix a skin tone would be red, yellow ochre and brown. If the skin's more pink toned, has a more pink undertone, then I'll mix in more red and less yellow. If it's more of a yellow undertone, then I'd mix in more yellow ochre rather than red. And if it's a darker skin tone, I'd mix in more brown. If it's a cool toned skin tone, then I may use more of a cool brown. Whereas if it's a warm skin tone, then I'll use more of a golden warm brown, or like a burnt sienna or something. So I'm adding the shadows for the lower part of the face now, under the lips, on the chin, going up towards the side of the face. Also adding the dot of shadow at the outer corner of the lips. Also getting in a little bit of shadow for the centre line of the lips. Don't worry if it looks a little bit of a mess right now. Just try and keep everything smooth. We can always use the coloured pencils if we need to fix anything. Now I'm going to blend out those brush strokes for the neck. We're keeping the neck quite expressive, so I'm going to allow those cauliflower effects to form to give more of an interesting look to the portrait. Once again, I'm taking a clean brush, just blending out the edges for the shadows at the side of the face. At the moment, I'm not worrying about layering different colour tints and hues. I will do that later on. For now, I'm just adding in the sort of shadows. But for example, the cheeks have got a very pink, rosy tone to them, so I will be layering in some pink later on. For now, I'm just worrying about the values. As you can see, the neck is forming that really nice cauliflower effect. If it's getting a bit out of hand, like it is on mine, I will go in and just blend over that with my brush, as you can see, and just get rid of part of that effect, just to clean up the edge, so that the top part of the neck is more realistic, and then it goes into more of an expressive style at the bottom of the neck. I'm just adding a little bit of shadow that's being cast by a few of these sections of hair, and I'm continuing that shadow over onto the left eye, just above the eyelid, going over where the eyebrow will be. We can add that in when we do add details later on. Once again, going in with a clean damp brush and just blending out any harsh edges. Doing the same thing with the chin. So now I'm adding a bit of water to pre-wet the shoulder, and I'm going to drop in some shadows at the top of the shoulder. At the top of the shoulder there is a small thin shadow being cast from the t-shirt. So now mixing up a darker skin tone yet again to darken up the shadows even more. Once again using the purple, the Payne's grey and the brown, mainly those three colours. And you can see that I've added in a little more brown with this mixture to make it more of a warmish tone. But I'm only using those three colours. I'm starting off by outlining under the jawline and the chin to get a really nice clean cut-off point between the face and the neck. I'm using that paint without much water in it at all to keep it really nice and dark. And as you can see, I've done a thick band of this shadow just below the chin, where it's the darkest. Now I'm cleaning off my brush, and I'm using that clean wet brush with quite a lot of water on it to try and blend downwards this paint. So I'm just blending it downwards so that it's darker right where the neck meets with the chin and the jawline, and then it gets lighter further down and it bleeds out a lot more. Adding a bit more shadow down the right hand side of the neck. And I'm picking up more of that darker paint and just fixing the outline for the face. I'm going by the cheeks and just getting in that darker line to indicate the shadows where the hair is, because that whole area is quite dark. Once again, I'm blending out the edges with a clean, damp brush so that it slowly fades into the rest of the skin colour. And if you want something to look realistic, it's all about the soft and subtle colour changes. Especially with the skin, where you can see the whole of the face, all of the changes in the shadows are going to be really soft. Doing the same thing with the left hand side of the face, just outlining that left hand side using that dark shadowed colour. Also, when you start to add in the really dark values, it does then help you to judge the rest of the face, because you may notice that you can go a lot darker, that your skin is not dark enough yet. So if you ever have a harsh edge that you want to blend out into the rest of the skin to create a soft transition, then just go in with a clean, damp brush and just blend it out. So I wet it again. I'm blending that shadow towards the cheek, looking at the shape of that shadow as it curves around the cheek, just leaving that little highlighted gap below the eyes on the cheekbone. Adding a bit more paint to darken up that shadow a bit more. Blending it towards the top of the eye. And also building up shadow in between the sections of hair. So once again, I'm just going to spend the next few minutes building up some more shadows in the same areas that we've added them before. I'm just going to be adding shadows above the eyes and below the eye, and in those areas that we've been working on. If there's any harsh edges, remember, just use a clean, damp brush to blend them out. And then I'll be back to talk you guys through the next step. Now that I've gone in and I've built up some more shadows around the eyes and the forehead, I'm going to work my way further down the face and work on the right hand side of the face. I'm getting in some shadows for the cheeks. I'm using quite a light wash of colour because these shadows aren't that dark, but it's important to get in even the subtle shadows. Only those really highlighted areas should be the first wash of the skin tone colour. But don't worry, if you need to go lighter with the skin tone, we can always use the coloured pencil to brighten up any areas, or even to darken up shadows as well. So you haven't got to do everything with the watercolour. I'm using the watercolour just to get most of the work done. If I need to tweak some things, then I will do that with the coloured pencils. It's a lot easier to just to shade something in and get it a little bit darker with the pencils. Watercolours are really good at giving you that base layer, giving you those really smooth values and those smooth transitions by using the wet and wet method. But for harsh details and defined fine details, it's great to use coloured pencils. So try and use and maximise the benefits of each of the mediums. So watercolours are great for covering a large area quickly, for getting those smooth tones and for building up those layers. And then colour pencils are great for adding in definition, adding in detail, adding in any little shadows or little highlights that you want to. I'm just using a hairdryer to quickly dry over the face, just to dry that layer really quickly. This is one of my key tricks that I love to do with watercolours. And I'm not holding it as close as it looks like I'm holding it with the camera. And I always use it on the cooler setting normally, not right on the burning hot setting. I just have it as a nice lightly warm air flow. So now that I've worked on the first layer of the skin, I'm going to start to build up some of those different hues in the skin. So if you look at some of the shadows on the nose as well, and underneath the nose, and especially around by the mouth and the chin, those shadows, you can see that some of the shadows are actually more of a greenish tone, more of an olivey tone. So I've mixed in a little bit of an olive green as well as a brown, so that I can get in more of this green hue into the skin. Mix in a bit of water with that paint, so it's not too dark. I don't want it to be really green and really obvious. I'm mixing up some more of that paint by mixing in more of that green and then more of the brown. Like I said, I'm using an olivey green, which is more of a yellowy green. I'm taking some of that paint into the palette above it, mixing in some more brown and just adding some more water. So it's more of a yellowy greenish undertone rather than dark green. I'm also building up, mixing another colour. I'm mixing some purple. I didn't realise actually that the light is shining and reflecting off of this section of the palette, so really sorry about that. But I am just mixing up some purple and some brown to create that darker colour for the skin, just like we did before. And with this, I want it to be even darker so that we're building up those darker shadows, which means that I'm using even less water in with that paint. As you want to make something darker and darker, you use less water mixed in with it. Once again, I'm just going to pre-wet the whole of the skin. Now that we've wet the skin, it's time to go in with our shadowed colour and start to build up the shadows again. And you can see that I'm just repeating the same process, adding the paint in the exact same areas that we've added shadows to before, but it's just about trying to get it even darker so that it finally matches the value of the reference image. So keep comparing your painting to your reference after every single layer and see what areas you still need to darken up a little bit. It's a lot easier to judge what you need to tweak once you let the layer of your painting dry, as like I said, it does dry lighter than it looks when it's wet. So I'm mainly focusing on adding some shadows to the forehead, the side of the face, also on the neck, so below the chin. Keeping it very sketchy as I don't need to worry about making this super smooth. Adding some shadow to the bottom of the face by the lips and the chin. So curving that shadow from the side of the face to the chin, and you can see that I'm doing that curve motion to give the look of a rounder, fuller look to the cheeks. It's important to look at the shape of each of the shadows as well, because it's really important for giving the accurate structure of the face. Adding some more shadow to the side of the nose. Getting in the shadows where they're supposed to be helps to give the face a lot of depth and a lot of dimension. Also using the clean damp brush just to blend over these edges to smooth it out, to create a really nice natural transition. Going to go over the nose, over the nostrils and that underneath part of the nose. Just darken that area up. And once again going over the sides of the nose to make it as dark as it needs to be. And like I said before, if you're noticing that the paper is starting to dry, wait for it to completely dry. Use that hairdryer to dry it off and then re-wet it again using some clean water and continue to build up your shadows like before. So now I'm just going to continue adding the shadows to the lower part of the face, around the lips, around the chin. And then I'll be back to talk you guys through the next step. Now once you've got in the shadows and you're happy with how the shadows look, wait for that layer to dry and then re-wet it again using some water. And in this layer we're going to start to build up those tints of different colours, like the bright pinks on the cheeks, like the yellowy green tones for some of the shadows. So once again, just re-wet the whole of this layer. Now that you've wet the skin all over, you can start to build up some of the different tints in the skin. I'm starting off by applying that yellowy green, and I mixed in a little more water just to make it a little bit more diluted, because I'm going to start off by adding it to the areas where it's just a really subtle tint of yellow. And I'm focusing firstly on the nose. You can see that there's a lot of a yellowy golden tint right on the sides of the nose. I've also mentioned before that there's more of that greeny yellow tint to the shadows under the lips and around the chin area. So I'm adding quite a lot of this colour to the chin and to the side of the face, down in that lower part of the face where I think it's in more shadow. It's not getting as much light to it, not compared to the cheeks, which are getting a lot more light. And adding multiple colours and layering different tints of colours to the skin really helps to make it look like realistic skin, to make it look like a realistic colour, to make it look healthy, and it really adds to the realism. Otherwise it can look a little flat if you don't add in different tints and hues to the skin. I'm using a bit more of that greeny tone now, that greeny skin tone that we mixed up. And I'm adding this to areas where you can quite physically see a bit of green in the skin, which is mainly for those darker skin tones, those darker shadows by the chin, between the eyes, in the forehead area, also around the sides of the face, and a little bit on the neck as well. Picking up a bit more of that yellowy tone and just adding it just by the outside corners of the lips and on the cupid's bow and on the tip of the nose. Adding it to the outer corners of the mouth as well. And from the sides of the nose going down onto the cheeks. So I'm just continuing to work my way throughout the skin, and I'm just adding the bit of yellowy green to wherever I can see and wherever I spot that it is on the reference image. Also, if I notice an area that I need to darken up more, I go in with that first skin shadow colour that we've been using, and I just darken it up a bit as well whilst this layer is still wet. So I'm going in and darkening up the tip of the nose a bit more. And we will add a lot more shadow using the watercolours in the next part, where we're adding more details to the face and getting in the facial features a bit more, like the eyes, nose and the mouth. And also with the coloured pencils you can darken up the nostrils, add in the freckles and stuff like that. So now I'm going in with some brighter pink, and I've just took this from the pan, and I'm going to add this a lot to the cheek areas. So I'm just spreading it all over the cheeks, and this helps to really give life to the skin. I'm also going to add it to the tip of the nose and to the centre part of the nose as well. Mixing up some more of the pink. Adding a bit to the forehead, under the eyes, and on the right hand, on the right cheek. I'm adding it to the chin a little bit as well. Once again to the tip of the nose, and anywhere in the reference where again I can see that that area of skin has got more of a pink tinge to it. Adding it a bit above the eyes. And because the other layers of the watercolour are already dry, they won't budge. So don't worry about now adding that paint over the shadows. It won't budge yet because those layers are already dry. You're working on a whole new layer. So you're just glazing those colours over the top. I'm intensifying the pink a bit more. So I start off with a little bit of pink and wait for that to spread out, and then I see if I want to add any more pink rather than just going in straight away with a lot of pink and it being too overwhelming and it overpowering the skin. So I'm just adding a little bit of pink around the eyes. But mainly I'm focusing the pink on the cheeks and the nose and the chin. They're the main areas where I can see pink. You can also add it over the top of the shadows to help give the shadows more of an accurate colour and to tint them a bit more, like I'm doing with the side of the nose. I'm adding a bit more shadow to the side of the nose. And so I'm just going to spend the next few minutes just tweaking the skin, adding a bit more pink, adding a bit more of those undertones, like those yellowy green undertones around the nose. And I'm just going to tweak it until I'm happy with how the skin is looking. Look and analyse your painting and see if you need to build up any more shadows, if you need to glaze any more hues onto the skin. So just spend these next couple of minutes just seeing what else you need to do before you call the skin finished. Okay, so that's it for part 1 of this tutorial, and in part 2 we're going to get started on the details for the face. I'm going to be starting off by doing the eyebrows, and I'm taking some brown and I'm going to mix in a little bit of black as well to make it a dark browny black tone, mixed in a little bit of water as well so it's not super dark. And I'm just starting off by painting in the individual eyebrow hairs. Now, because this is a child, normally child's eyebrows aren't really dark and thick, they are a little bit lighter. Hers are a little bit darker, I think, because the hair is covering them quite a lot as well, especially on the left-hand side. On the left-hand side, we can't see much of the eyebrow, but I'm just going in and just blocking in those eyebrow hairs and also just defining the eyelid crease as well, using that same paint. Now, some tips for when you're painting in the eyebrow hairs is just make sure that you're focusing on the direction they're going in. Focus on the length they are, and do they curve? Have they got more of a curve to them? I like to build up my eyebrows by drawing in individual hairs to make it look more natural and organic. And once again, just like we did with the skin, you can build up multiple layers. So you can do a very simple first layer for the eyebrows and just block them in. And then once you've done that first layer, you can go back in, add in a few more details. You can start off light and then build up to those darker eyebrow hairs. Now I'm going to go in and start to work on the eyes. I'm just building up a really dark line for the top of the eye, for that upper lash line. So I'm just going around the shape of the eye using that same dark brown black paint mixture. I've got less water mixed in with it now to make sure that it's really nice and dark, just like it is in the reference. Going back and darkening up the upper crease, the eyelid crease. I'm just going to blend out the eyelid, blend out that shadow. Using a really small round brush. So when I'm painting in details, I try and use a really small round brush. Now I'm painting in the edge of the iris. Again, I'm using that same colour, that brown black tone. We're going to use this for a sort of underpainting, getting in that first layer. And I'm starting off by painting in the pupil and painting in the darker edge around the iris. Be careful when you're painting in the pupil that you don't accidentally paint over any bright highlights. Don't worry too much, you can always add them in afterwards with a white gel pen or some white paint. But if you can preserve them, it just makes it a lot more accurate and easier. I'm now looking in the iris and identifying where the darkest shadows are. And I'm starting off painting those areas in, those darker shadows. Mainly around the edge of the iris and the top of the iris as well. Being very careful as I do this. When I paint the next eye, I will show you a closer up version that I was able to catch with my side camera. And I just use a little bit of water on my brush just to fill in those mid-tone areas with a lighter wash of that colour. I'm also going around the tear duct. And once again, I'm using a clean brush just to blend out that shadow onto the white of the eye. Cleaning up the shape of the iris. And you can see that I've preserved that highlight. I'm adding a little more shading to the white of the eye, just using the leftover brown paint on the brush, just taking a tiny bit of brown paint and working it mainly in the inner corner of the white of the eye where that tear duct is, and around the top of the white of the eye as well. You can see that that gives it a lot more of a 3D look to it. It doesn't look as flat. I'm also going to start to go in and do a couple of little lines for the lower eyelashes, and these are really tiny and actually very light, so I'm not using too much paint on my brush so that they stay nice and light, and I'm trying to get my lines as thin as possible to make them look really natural. And because you're drawing a child, while you're painting in a child's eyelashes, they tend not to be wearing makeup, so their eyelashes are going to be a lighter colour. They're not going to be jet black, they're going to be like a light brown tone. So I'm just going to continue to tweak this eye until I'm happy with it, and then I'll move on to the next eye. Now I'm just going to repeat the exact same process on the other eye. Like I said, you've got a much better angle now from my side camera. And I'm just starting off by doing the same thing by blocking in that upper lash line, and then I'll continue to fill in the pupil, the edge of the iris, getting those eyelashes, and use a bit of water to fill in any of the mid-tone areas. So I'm just going to go ahead and do the same process for this eye. And then once again, I'll come back to talk you guys through the next part, but I'm not doing anything differently with this eye. So I've nearly finished this eye. It's just time to get in those couple of little eyelashes, and you can see how carefully I'm painting these in and how much of a light hand I'm using the brush with. It's very important that you make them really nice and light and really thin as well. So I'm just using the tip of the brush to get them in. And it makes it easier if your brush is fairly dry and hasn't got much paint on there. Makes it easier to get these little thin light eyelashes. Also, when I'm painting in the upper eyelashes, they tend to curve outwards and they get longer as you get towards the outer corner. I'm just using a bit of water to blend out that eyelid crease, that shadow for the eyelid crease. I also used the same technique just to block in that eyebrow, but really can't see much of the eyebrow because the hair's covering it. So I just sort of did a block where the shape of the eyebrow is that we can see. Filling in a little bit of the white of the eye. And we will be glazing over a little bit of green later on for the eyes, but you can see already how realistic they are looking. Now that we've done with the eyes, it's time to move on to just rendering the nose a little bit. And the main area that we're going to be focusing on is the nostrils and the lower part of the nose. So that underneath side where it's a lot more shadowed. Once again, I'm using the exact same paint. I've not mixed up any other colour. And I'm starting off just by outlining where the nostril is and the side of the nose. I mixed in a little more water just to get a lighter value, which is good for the shadows. I'm only using that really dark paint on the nostrils because the rest of the nose isn't as dark as that. So I mixed in a little more water just so that the colour's appropriate then for the shadows. Just like before, I use a clean damp brush to blend out any edges. Adding a bit more of that shadowed colour to the tip of the nose. And I'm just going to build up some shadows on the side of the nose. Once again, I'm just going to spend the next few minutes building up some shadows on the nose, mainly that underside and the tip of the nose. And then I'll come back to talk you guys through the next part. Now that we've worked on the nose, it's time to start blocking in the lips. So I'm mixing up quite a bright pink red tone by mixing together some pink, some red, and a little bit of purple as well. And if you look at the reference, you can see that her lips are a very vibrant pinky red colour. And so I'm just taking this colour that I've mixed up. I've not mixed in really much water yet. And I'm just starting off by adding a nice wash of this colour all over the top lip. and the center line. So I'm blocking in the top of the lip, so that top outline of the lip and the center line first, using that really thick dark paint. Darkening it up even more with a bit of that browny black paint from before, from what we used for the eyes and the nose. I'm also using the pink to get in that little bit of shadow at the top of the bottom lip. And also getting in the bit of shadow right at the bottom of that lower lip as well. Now I'm cleaning off my brush, getting a bit more water on there, and I'm just going to blend those mid-tone areas of the lips. So blend and pull some of that colour from those darker areas into the lighter areas to fill them in as well. So I'm blending out the bottom of the lip. Taking a bit more of that darker tone and using that to try and soften out that outline for the bottom lip. And already we've got a really nice colour for the lips. We've got the shadows where they need to be. I'm just going to darken up the centre of the mouth a bit more. Now I'm going in with a clean damp brush. Make sure you haven't got much water on that. And I'm just creating that highlight for the bottom lip in the middle. And if your watercolour is still wet, it will really easily pull up that watercolour to reveal a really nice highlight. I'm also adding some detail to the outer corner of the lips, getting in those couple of shadows. Just using a tissue to blot off the excess watercolour. And you can see that just by getting in the eyes and the details on the nose and the mouth, this portrait is really coming together. So now I'm going to start to define the chin a bit more and the sides of the face. So I'm using that dark brown and black paint. And I'm just outlining around the face, around the jawline, around the chin. Just darken that area up. Just use my finger to soften it out. Mixing up a bit more of that paint, the same colour. And I'm just going to continue to define the face, to define the side of the face as well. Just to get the shape of the face correct to the reference. As well as adding an outline around the sides of the face, I will also use this paint to darken up the eyebrow hairs a little bit, just to make them a little bit darker, as I feel that they need to match the colour of the eyelashes and the sort of iris colour, like in the reference. So as you can see, I'm just cleaning up the edge of the face, but then I will add a little bit of this colour to the eyebrows, and I'll also darken up the center line for the lips once I've just done the side of the face and the shape of the face. So once I've done those couple of things, I'll then come back to talk you guys through the next step. Okay, so now that we've pretty much finished with those details, I have decided that I'm actually going to go in and add one more layer to the skin. It becomes a lot easier to see if you need to darken up any areas once you've got in the eyes, the nose and the mouth, because those areas are the darkest, and it therefore then makes the rest of the face look really light. So I'm just using my brush to carefully wet the skin, being very careful not to go over the eyes and the nose and the mouth, and of course make sure that you've waited for that previous layer to completely dry before you go ahead and do this. So make sure that the shadows on the nose are dry, and for the eyebrow make sure all of those areas are nice and dry first, and then just pre-wet the skin as usual. Now it's time to mix up our shadowed skin tone as usual, using the dark brown, some purple. It's just the same colours. It's really hard to see with the light reflecting on this section of the palette. I really wish I hadn't done that. But yeah, just mix those same colours, and I really just want to get everything as intense as it needs to be. So I'm focusing on really just tapping in this really dark colour wherever it needs to go. I'm being a lot bolder with adding in these shadows now, because I noticed from getting in those details that we do need to go darker. And I'm working quickly whilst the paper is still wet, starting off with the top of the face, getting in those shadows for the forehead and around the eyebrows, between the hair as well. Also working on the side of the face and around the chin, and basically everywhere that we've gone over multiple times. This is just the layer where we really want to get them as dark as they need to be. So I'm just going around the top and the bottom of the chin, leaving that little highlight in the middle of the chin. Also adding in the shadows for the cheeks. At the bottom of the cheeks, going up towards the side of the nose. I'm adding a bit more shadow underneath the eye. So you may not need to do this step. If you feel like you already got the skin in your painting dark enough, then you can miss out this step. It's completely up to you. This is the time where you need to analyze your own painting and really judge for yourself whether you think you need to make any changes or whether you're happy with how yours looks already. You don't have to do every single step that I do if you feel like your painting is already there, because you don't want to end up making it too dark. This is just a step that you can do if, like me, you felt like your painting was a little bit too light compared to all of the dark details that you've just got in. So once again, I'm just going to repeat the same process, the same technique, and just block in this final layer of shadows. And the final thing that I want to do is once again go in and add a bit more pink to the cheeks. I definitely feel like they need to be a bit more saturated. We need to make them a bit more rosy looking. So I'm taking some of that pink. I'm also adding it underneath the eyes, as I feel like those areas need to be a bit more pink toned. But mainly I'm going to focus this colour on the cheeks just like before. And then once I've done that step, I will move on to quickly blocking in the clothing before we move on to the hair. And the clothing is going to be really simple because I want to keep it very loose and very expressive. And I'm going to be using the same pink that I'm using for the cheeks. So I'm simply just taking that pink, and this is actually the colour that we used for the lips, just with a bit more water mixed in. Add it a little bit to the tip of the nose as well, and for the middle of the nose. I'm making sure to leave little highlights quite bright. Like there is a small highlight on like the tip of the nose towards the left hand side that I've kept fairly light. Now I'm just adding a tinge of that pink to the white of the eyes. And so once you've done that, you'll be ready to move on to painting in the clothing. For the clothing, I need to mix up a larger quantity of that pink, and I'm using quite a light wash, so I've mixed in a little bit of water, and I'm simply just very loosely blocking in where the clothing is. So it goes a little bit around the shoulder. I'm being careful to leave out and preserve the little sections of the hair that are flowing onto the clothing. So you can see that I've left a few pieces there, and there's just a little bit on the other side that we can see. There's really not that much of the clothing that we can see. I'm also tapping in a little bit of purple just to make it more interesting and more colourful. I'm also adding in a bit more of a reddy tone as well. I'm creating a few little splatters using the pink to give it more of that expressive look to it. I'm also adding a little bit of Payne's Grey just to add a bit of shadow. But that's really all I'm going to do with the clothing. If you ever get anything on an area that you don't want it to be, like that little dark splatter, you can always go in and use a tissue to lift it up. I'm tapping in some brighter pink. And keep in mind that the watercolour dries lighter than it is when it's wet. I'm adding some more shadow to the shoulder to make it look accurate to the rest of the skin. And you can see that this whole area looks very loose, very expressive, and it complements the face really nicely, which is a lot more realistic. So now let's move on to the next part, which is painting in the hair. And this is the best part of this sort of portrait for me, because with the hair I try and be really loose and expressive. So her hair is like a dark blonde, so I'm mixing up some yellow ochre and a little bit of brown, adding in some water so that it's not bright yellow. The water helps to dilute it and give it a bit more of that blondish tone. And also mixing in the brown with the yellow ochre helps to give it more of that blonde tone as well. And I've got a much larger round brush, and I'm simply just sweeping this paint, this wash of really light blonde colour, just sort of blocking in the shape of the hair. I'm doing a few little brush strokes to indicate loose individual bits of the hair as well, coming off towards the side of the hair. But really, I'm just adding a base wash of colour all over the hair. Doing these big sort of motions, big brush strokes with the brush. And I really just quickly want to block it all in, because I want to work on the hair and add in some really cool effects and drop in other colours whilst this first wash is still wet. So it's really important that you work quickly with this. As you can see, I'm simply just blocking in where the hair is, not worrying about being perfect, being actually very messy. And that's the key to doing this. To make it look loose and expressive, you have got to be very loose and expressive yourself. Now that I've got in that light wash of blonde, I'm mixing in a dark brown into that colour so that we can start to get in the shadows. And like I said, I'm working on this whilst that first wash is still wet, so that we can have this really nice wet on wet technique going on so that the colours can bleed into each other. I mixed in a little bit of black with the paints to get in these really dark shadows by her face. And once again, I'm doing the same process of doing these big sweeping motions with the brush just to block in where these shadows are. And I'm not looking at getting in lots of detail with this, I'm just getting in where the core shadows are. It really doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to give you the general idea of where the shadows are in the hair, and I'm using the brush strokes going with the direction of the hair to help give it motion and help give the hair more volume and more body to it. One thing that I'll also be doing a lot is tapping in drops of water, drops of clean water, to create cauliflower effects in the hair. And I'll also be doing splatters to again add more of an expressive look to the hair. So I'm adding lots of splatters all around the hair to make it look really exciting, really explosive. I'm also pulling a bit more of that blonde colour into the background. And I'm doing that on the other side of the hair. And already you can see that we've got the hair in. It looks like hair, but it's got such a loose and fun style to it. I also just tapped in a few more of those water drops with my brush. What I do there is I load my brush up with clean water, and then I simply just tap the brush and it creates cauliflower effects, which look so cool. Once again, I'm building up more of those shadows using the brown and black mixture. We really want to get in that contrast. We really want to make the hair look nice and intense. It may look like you've got it dark enough, but as the colours bleed and they spread out, because we're using the wet and wet method, it will get lighter as it spreads out, so then you'll need to darken it up again quickly before the layer dries. Even when I'm painting the hair in an expressive way, I still like to focus on going in the direction the hair is going in. It's very important that you go with the direction of the hair to make it look expressive but realistic at the same time, if that makes sense. So just a few brush strokes, a few lines going with the direction of the hair just helps you to see that it's hair, and it really helps just make it look realistic. You don't want to go overboard because it's not trying to be a realistic piece, a realistic hair painting, but getting in a few lines just really does help to make it look like hair. You want to still be able to tell that it's hair. So I mainly do these few detailed lines mainly as flyaway hairs, or like I did with the fringe. I like to keep some areas more realistic, and then the larger masses and larger sections of the hair can be more loose and expressive. Building up some more shadows yet again. And I'm just focusing on picking out the darkest areas in the hair where the shadows are in the hair. And I'm just adding the paint in those areas. One thing that I wanted to make sure that I didn't do with this hair, this part of the painting with the hair, is I didn't want to overdo it. It can be really easy to overdo something, especially if you're trying to do something very loose and expressive. Simplicity is key. You don't want to work too much on something that you want to be loose. So try and be quick, try and be expressive, try not to think about it too much. You still want to think and plan what you want to do, but if you focus on it and try and do too many details and make it too accurate to the reference, then it will start to look too realistic. It won't be a loose piece anymore. If you've followed it exactly like the reference, then it's no longer loose. So I'm just adding a few more brush strokes, a few of those little flyaway hairs. Mixing up some darker paint and just adding a few splatters around the side of the hair. But I'm really happy with how the hair is looking. So soon we'll be moving on to the really fun part, which is adding coloured pencils. And that's just really going to help pull everything together and make it look really, really polished and finished. Especially with the skin, we need to add in the freckles. We need to add a bit more of the sort of skin tone, add a bit more shadows, add a bit more detail to the lips and stuff like that. I won't use the coloured pencils to add lots of detail to the hair. That will still stay very much watercolour based, but I will be using the colour pencils mainly on the face. I want to make sure that we've really got that cauliflower effect going on. So I'm taking a lot of water on my brush and I'm just splattering it all over the hair so that as it bleeds out, as the water bleeds into the rest of the paint, we get these starry clusters that are really cool. They look really expressive and they give such an interesting look to the painting. And as you can see in especially the darkest areas of the hair that the cauliflower effects really do look pretty, and they really they take it to that next level. I'm also mixing in a bit more of a yellowy ochre to the hair just to make it a bit more vibrant in a couple of areas. So like in the base layer where we mix yellow ochre and brown, now I'm just adding in a little wash of the yellow ochre. I'm just finishing off the hair with a couple more shadows, especially around the fringe area. But once again, try not to overdo it. If you feel like you've come to a nice point with the hair and you really like how it looks, then just stop and wait for it to dry. There's no reason why you need to keep adding lots more detail. We're going for such an expressive look that you can just wait for it to dry how you like it. There's no clear way because we're being expressive, so express your creativity and go for a style you like. I'm now just taking a clean sort of damp brush and I'm just using that to lift some highlights. And again, I'm doing the highlights in lines that are going with the direction the hair is going in, just to add a little more detail and a little more contrast. Tapping in a little more yellow ochre throughout the piece, throughout the hair. But I really love how the hair looks. Okay, so wait for that to completely dry and get your coloured pencils ready because we're going to start using them to add some details. So I'm going to be using the white Prismacolor pencil. All of the colours will be listed in the description if you want to get them all ready. But I'm starting off with the white pencil and I'm going to use this to pull up a few highlights in the face. So I just firstly went over the highlights in the eyes, and I'm also using the white Prismacolor pencil to whiten up the inner corner of the eye and also the waterline. I'm also using it to add a little bit of highlight just above the nostril. And I'm going to start to use it to add some highlight just under the eyes at the top of the cheeks. And I'm looking around the reference and I'm just going and adding the highlights as I notice them. For example, I noticed that the middle of the bottom lip needed to be a bit brighter, as well as the outer corners. So I'm just going in and I'm brightening them up. And you can see that the coloured pencil sticks really well to the paper, especially because this is cold pressed paper, which has a lot of texture to it. So this is a great way to finish off your paintings if you want to add a little more detail, or if you couldn't get something quite right with your watercolours. Also, look at the hair, look at the top left of the hair, how when it dried it creates such a cool large cauliflower effect. I love that. I'm also adding a little bit of highlight above the top lip, around the sides of the cupid's bow. And I'm basically adding the white to the brightest points of the face. I'm also brightening up that highlight on the nose. Try not to go overboard with the white, just use it for those brightest highlights. So now I'm going in with the medium flesh, and this is a polychromos color. This is a very much like a pinkish tone. So if you don't have this exact color, this is mainly like a pinky color. And I just layered that on the eyelid and on the side of the eye, and then went over it with the white. I'm also going in with the white and just brightening up the other eyelid, once again going over with the medium flesh just to tone it down so it wasn't so bright. I'm using the medium flesh once again on the nose, on the sides of the nose, on the tip of the nose. These pink based flesh colours are really good because her skin has definitely got much more of a pink tone to it. I'm also using this colour to add more of a pink tone to the cheeks. And I'm being very light with these coloured pencils because I'm just sort of tinting the colours. So I'm barely touching the colour to the paper. And I did sharpen all of my pencils before starting this so that they're all ready to create details and for really soft shading. I'm mainly using this medium flesh wherever I can see an area that needs a bit more of a pink tone to it, which is most parts of the face. Now I'm going to go in with the Caput Mortuum Violet. And I'm going to be using this colour to add in all of the shadows for the face, as I feel like this colour matches the watercolour that we used the best. So this is like a purpley reddy tone, purpley reddy browny tone. So once again, I'm just going over the sides of the face because those areas are some of the darkest. And we will soften out the shading a bit more with a lighter colour. So don't worry if when you add this darker colour, if it looks a little bit grainy, because we will blend it out a bit more in a minute. I'm also darkening up around the eye, at the top of the nose. And basically anywhere that I feel needs to go a little bit darker. Once again, the areas you may want to add this to may be different than where I'm using it. Adding some shading to the corner of the mouth, to the bottom of the chin. So now I'm going to go in with the colour Sanguine, and this is where we're going to start to add in the freckles. So this bit was really fun to do, and I'm just lightly going in with that pencil and just creating these little sort of dots, and I'm trying to make them slightly different sizes, slightly different shapes. Sometimes with some of the freckles I'm applying a bit more pressure to make them a bit darker. Sometimes I'm barely touching the pencil to the paper to make them a lot more subtle. And with freckles, you want to just have that variety. Otherwise, they will look fake, and you want to make them look like they're part of the skin. So you do want to have a natural variety to them. You want to have a natural variety for the shapes and the sizes and how dark they are. And you also want to make sure that you're curving them with the contours of the face. So for example, curve it round with the side of the nose. And I'm just going to repeat the same process for the other cheek. Just adding those few details just really helps to finish off the face. So just continue to go throughout the whole of the skin with the Sanguine, just blocking in the freckles. Now that we've blocked in the freckles with the sanguine, I'm going in with the burnt sienna, and I'm using this just to add in some darker freckles. So you can add in some new darker freckles, or you can go over some of the freckles that you got in with the sanguine. But really I just wanted to add 2 different tones to the freckles to again make them look more natural. I'm also using it to add a bit more definition to the eye, to both of the eyes. For example, going over the upper crease. And using it to clean up the bottom of the lips. So adding in a little bit of a shadow at the outer corner of the lips as well. Adding some shadow up the side of the face. Like I said, with these darker colours, please don't worry if it's looking a little bit grainy. You shouldn't be applying much pressure at all with these pencils. But if you have got a little bit of graininess like I have, don't worry, it will be really easy to fix and it will go in a minute once I blend it out with a other pencil, with a lighter pencil. Once again, just continue to go in and use the burnt sienna on any shadows that you need to. I'm swapping between that and the Caput Mortem Violet again, which we used at the start for some of these shadows. And just use this to add a bit more shading to any shadows that you feel need to be a little bit darker. Now I'm going to go in with the Pompion Red, and I'm going to use this to add more of a reddy pink tone, more of a stronger, more saturated pink tone to the nose and mostly to the lips as well. So I'm transitioning from the shadows on that top lip into the highlights a little bit more. And you can use this to add any creases that you want to add, any texture. Like I'm doing, I'm creating little lines that are curving around the rest of the lips, curving with the shape of the lips. I'm using that same colour in the tear duct area and in the white of the eyes. Also adding it a little bit on the waterline. And I'm going to do the same thing with the other eye. Also adding it a little bit to the shadow underneath the eye. I'm also adding a little bit of this Pompion Red for the shadows by the nose. Switching back over to the Caput Mortem Violet. Now I'm going to go in with the medium flesh again, and I'm just going to go over the shadowed areas that we've got in, that we've added layering to, just using this medium flesh. And this will help to soften out some of that graininess as well, because the more layers of colour pencil you add to an area, the softer it's going to start to look. Now I'm going to go in with the black and just use this to darken up parts of the eye. So I'm going in and darkening up the iris and the pupil, just to make it as dark as it needs to be. I'm also going to do the same thing with the eyelid crease. And I'm going to repeat the same process for the other eye. I'm also going to go in and use the black to darken up the nostrils and the center line of the mouth. Now I'm going in with the chrome oxide green, and I'm just going to add this a little bit over the iris just to give it more of a green tinge. Switching over to the white, just going over where I added that green just to make it a bit lighter and to add more of a lighter mid-tone to the iris. I'm also going over it with a little bit of the brown ochre. Sorry, the raw umber. I'm going to use this to add more of a golden tone to the eyes. So now I'm just darkening up the eye with the dark brown. And you can use the dark brown and the colour pencils to add in eyelashes if you want to, if you don't want to use the watercolour. So I'm just using the colour pencil to define the eyelashes a bit more and to add some more in. You can also use it to add some more individual eyebrow hairs, just to make the eyebrow look a little more natural. You can also use the dark brown to add some shadow to the skin as well. So I'm using the dark brown just to add a bit more shading, especially around the side of the face. I'm also adding a little bit of shading to the side of the nose and to the nostrils. Now I'm going to go back in with that raw umber and just use this to add that yellowy undertone to the side of the nose and to those places where we added that yellowy greenish colour when we were painting in the skin in the first part. So you can add this over the top of the shadows, and like I said, on the nose, that's where you can see this golden tone quite a lot. Probably a reflection from the hair. Also adding it a little bit to the side of the face. So just continue to add this colour anywhere that you feel needs a bit more of a gold tone to the skin. So now I'm going to go back in with the sanguine and just add in some darker freckles. So I'm adding a little more pressure just to create some more visible freckles. You could also use the burnt sienna as well to do this. So you can see that I'm doing a tapping motion quite a lot to create the really small tiny freckles. Also going back in with the medium flesh and the colour Madder. Now I'm using this colour once again to soften out the lips, soften out the colour changes where the shadows meet with the highlights. And also just to darken up some of those shadows a bit more. I'm switching over to the Caput Mortem Violet and just darkening up the shadow directly under the middle line between the lips. So I'm just going to continue to tweak the lips until I'm happy with how they look. I'm now using the white just to add a couple more highlights within the eyes. Brighten up the white of the eye, the inner corner, anywhere where you notice that you could brighten it up a little bit. Use a bit more pressure on your white pencil where you want it to be more opaque, where you want the white to really stand out. Or if you just want a subtle highlight, then barely press the pencil to the paper. I'm going to use it again at the top of the cheeks to really brighten up that point of the face. I'm going back in with the black and just darkening up the nostrils and the side of the nose. Also using it to darken up the middle of the mouth. I'm also going to add a little bit of shadow throughout the hair as well. So I'm going to do a couple of dark pencil strokes. I'm doing a little bit of shading with the black. I'm just darkening up the hair by the side of the face. Also defining the bottom of the chin a bit more. Using the brown to make it look a bit more natural. Now I'm going to switch back over to the raw umber and I'm going to do a couple of little lines going throughout the hair. Mainly I'm doing this to cover up any pencil sketch lines that I can see peeping through the watercolour. So that's mainly how I'm deciding where I want to add in this pencil, but I'm also using it to add a couple of flyaway hairs. Once again, adding a little bit more to the nose. It's okay to switch back to colours that you've already used if you notice a certain part of the face that needs a little more of that colour. Adding a bit more of the medium flesh to the tip of the nose. I'm adding a bit more highlight using the white to the nose as well. So now I'm just working on tweaking and adjusting the face until I'm happy with it, and then I'll move on to the next main part. But for now I'm just tweaking the little things that I notice. Now I'm going to go back in with the burnt sienna and just use this to add in some darker freckles. Again, using the exact same technique as before, just to make them stand out a little more and to add more variety. Again, you can apply a bit more pressure to the burnt sienna to get some darker freckles, and then be really light to get some more subtle ones as well. Now it's time to soften everything out, and to do that I'm using the colour Putty Beige. But you can use any sort of beigey colour. You want to use a colour that is similar to the sort of base colour of the skin, and this colour is great for softening out the graininess. It really gets rid of that graininess while still keeping the details and keeping it the same colour mainly. So here you can see a closer up shot of me blending out the skin, and you can see that it's not really changing the colour that much, but it's softening out and giving a really smooth look to the skin. It's making it look so nice and smooth. It's getting rid of all of that graininess, even when we're blending out the shadows. I'm going in sort of circular motions. My pencil's really nice and sharp, and I'm not applying much pressure at all, just enough pressure to get it to blend, because we're not trying to make the drawing this specific colour, so it's really just to try and bind that pigment together and to get rid of any graininess. So just continue to do this throughout the areas of coloured pencil that are looking a bit grainy that you want to smooth out. I'm mainly focusing on doing this with the shadows. You could also use the white pencil to blend out lighter areas, or like I said, to add in some more highlights, which I'm doing now that I've blended everything out using that Putty Beige pencil. You can also use a mixture of them both. You can use a little bit of the Putty Beige and a little bit of the whites to blend out those lighter areas. You can also use the Putty Beige to add in highlights to certain areas where the white would be too bright. For example, I'm doing that with the eyelids. I'm also adding a little bit of white in between the lower eyelashes. Adding a bit more white in the inner corner of the eye. And to the side of the nose. Going over it with the putty beige to make it more of an accurate colour. And I'm just cleaning up the edge of the nose with the burnt sienna. Going back in with the burnt sienna, and I'm just adding a couple more freckles. You can soften over the freckles and make them look more subtle and natural and part of the skin by going over them with the putty beige, or in the highlighted areas you can go over them with the white pencil, and that will really just help them look like they're part of the skin. I'm also going back in with the burnt sienna and just using that to add a bit more shadow to a couple of shadows. Also using the Caput Mortem Violet to darken up the shadows as well. And once again, once you've darkened up the shadows, you can go back in with the beige and blend it out and get rid of any more of that graininess. So really, the next few minutes is just about tweaking things and making sure that you're happy with how everything looks. We're coming to the end of this painting and drawing now. So it's really just about looking at your piece and seeing what you want to adjust. What detail do you need to add, and what colours do you need to adjust? Now I'm going to spend the next sort of 5 minutes just tweaking my piece using the same colours that I have been using, just to get it how I want mine to look, and then I will come back to talk you guys through the final step in this painting drawing piece. finish off this painting, I want to add some really nice sparkling highlights. So I am using a white gel pen. This is the Sakura Jelly Roll gel pen, and I'm using this to add highlights in the eyes, to tap in some highlights in the waterline and in the inner corner of the eye, and I'm just using this to really create some sparkly highlights. I'll also use it to add a little bit of highlight to the hair. I'm tapping it to create some sparkly highlights on the top of the cheeks. And so yeah, this is just the final step to get in those brightest highlights and to finish off the piece. Once again, you can turn back to the colored pencils and use them again if you notice something that you need to adjust, as you can see me doing throughout this step. But I really like to add a lot of white gel pen around the eyes because I think there's so many areas with the eyes that are glistening. You've got the waterline, you've got the white of the eye, you've got the iris that tends to have highlight in it. I'm also tapping in some highlights for the nose and for the middle of the bottom lip. Switching over to the white pencil to add some highlights, some texture to that lip. And I'm tapping in a few highlights throughout the freckled area as well. You can tap your finger over the white gel pen if you want to make an area look a little more subtle. I'm adding some highlight by the outer corner of the mouth. Adding some to the middle of the bottom lip. I'm going to add a few lines throughout the hair, just to make the hair look a little more interesting. I'm mainly going to be focusing a couple of lines throughout the fringe. And once I've added in these couple of lines, then I can call this piece finished. So now this painting is finished, and here you can see the final piece. I really hope you guys enjoyed following along with this tutorial. This is a very different sort of style for me and I really enjoyed doing it, and I'd like to create a lot more paintings like this. Thank you guys for following along with this tutorial. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye everybody.